Hey everyone, welcome to Unit 2 of the Intermediate Excel course. In this video, we're going to be discussing relative and absolute formula references. So that sounds more complicated than it is, but in simple English, what we're saying is, how do you lock columns and how do you lock rows when you're doing formulas? And this is really important when you're working with arrays of data or ranges of data, so that when you drag down your formula or across, that it does what you intended it to, i.e. you're pulling from and looking from the right rows and columns as you thought. So for example, let's go through a simple formula. And I appreciate that we probably haven't gone through detailed formulas yet, like we have in previous videos. We went through basic formulas in previous videos. We haven't gone through sophisticated formulas. So hopefully the SUMIF formula we can use as an example without it being too sophisticated. But let's start off with the video first by just explaining the SUMIF formula, what it does, how it works, and then we'll use that as a basis to explain relative and absolute formula references. So to start with, what is a SUMIF formula? Well, it's a formula that you'll come across very, very often in Excel, especially in your professional career, in the workplace. It's a formula that you'll need to use over and over and over and again. But what does it do? Well, essentially, the definition of this formula is that it adds the value of items which match criteria set by the user. So here's our definition down here. So in other words, we want to look for something, right? For example, tires within a data set, and return the value, the sum of all values which meet that. So for example, within this list, what a SUMIF would do is, if we were looking for tires, it would pick up all the tires in this list. So let's just quickly do a, so let's just type tires in here. I'm just going to quickly do a conditional format here. To just show you how to do it. We're going to cover what a conditional formatting is later in the video. Later in the intermediate course. So don't worry too much about learning how to do this in this video. This is really just to illustrate, this example here. So now we can see that when we type tires in here, it's going to look for all the tires over here. So this one, and this one. So all three of them. And it's going to sum the value that we determined. So in this case, we're setting the value to return in this column over here. So it's going to pull the cost for tires of this, this, and this. So 325. So similarly, if we were to put window, there's only one window in here. So it's going to return the value of this window and 50. And one more example, if we do service, it's going to look for service. Let's look at the formula. It's going to look for service in this column and return the sum of these values. So in this case, it's going to say, well, there's two services. So I'm going to sum this one and this one. Okay, but let's say we have a different data set, right? So let's say that this is just the cost for this particular month. And I'm just going to put in some random values so we can see how this works. So let's go between 30 and 150. I'm just going to do it across a bunch of different months. So this is going to be January. So they go 31/1/2022. Let's just quickly format this date as well. Okay, and then what we're going to do is I'm going to show the cost depending on what time of year it is. And what else we're going to do is we're going to format paint all of these so that it's consistent data. And then we're also going to make the width of each of those rows not as wide. Just make this a bit smaller so we can see it on our screen. Okay, so we've got the different costs depending on what type of year it is. I'm just going to hard code these values as well. Okay, so depending on what type of year it is, because of inflation, the cost is dramatically changing, right? So let's say that we want to actually change this formula. So keep in mind, the formula works by saying, look at this range. So range is where we're looking. Next is the criteria, so comma criteria. Criteria is this word over here. So service is what we're looking for. And then the range, the sum range, is where we pull the value from. Okay. So let's, I'm just going to remove this for a moment. So let's say that we wanted to copy this formula across and do it so that we also had it for February. So let's go ahead and do that. If we copy that across, what do you think is going to happen? Well, if you look at the formula, actually what's happened is both columns have moved across one because we've dragged the formula across one. So everything, including the range, the criteria, and the sum range, have moved across one. So you can see that the range is now pulling from the date. The criteria is no longer pulling from service, it's pulling from this one over here, which is incorrect. And also the sum range is pulling from, okay, the sum range is working okay, it's pulling from the correct month. But what we need to fix is that these two moved across when they shouldn't have. And it also means that as we continue to drag it across, we're also going to have the same issue of it continually moving along. So how do we fix this? Well, we fix this with relative and absolute formula references. So we need to understand what they mean and what are the options. So in Excel, we need to lock down we can either lock down a column or a row. So for example, because these ones kept moving across, what we want to do is we want to lock the column of two things. We want to lock the column of where we're pulling the data from, so the items, right? So the range, we want to lock that as a column. And also for the criteria, we also want to lock this as a column because we don't want to move this across. You can also lock things by a row. So if we had a different data set that we wanted to pull the value down this way, then the formula would also move down. But it just so happens in this case that we don't need to pull data down. So the locking is optional on the row. But a lot of the time you'll need to consider, do I need to lock this on a column? Do I need to lock it on a row? Okay. So for this case, we only want to lock the column, and locking the row is optional. So how do we do this? Well, there's three options, right? So we can either lock the row, we can lock the column, or we can lock both. Or I guess a fourth one is neither, which is we don't lock anything, which is what we're currently doing because there's no dollar signs. So where there's a dollar sign, it indicates that we've locked either a column or a row. So if you see a dollar sign, it means something's locked. So when we say relative or absolute formula reference, absolute basically means it's fixed in one place. Relative means you can move it around, right? So that's where the name comes from. But if that's too complicated, just think about it as locking. So most people use their keyboard to lock. And basically the shortcut key to do this is F4. But the other way you can do it, and the way I'm going to show you, is basically just to put a dollar sign before where you want it. And we need to understand the placement. It's really important. So basically, if you put the dollar sign before the letter, remember the letter is the column, it's going to lock the column, but it's not going to lock the row. Whereas if you put the dollar sign before the row, remember the rows are numbers, then it will lock that row, but it won't lock the column. And if you put a dollar sign before both, it means that cell's not moving anywhere. It's locked to both the column and the row. It is not moving. So where would we want this example where it's locked for both? Well, probably we want to lock the column and the row for the criteria because we don't want it to move down and we don't want it to move it across. So we want to lock the column so it doesn't move across, and we don't want it to move down, so we want to lock the row. So how we do that is, let's update the format over here. So with the criteria, we want to add a dollar sign before the E and before the 18. Now let's see what happens when we drag that across. let's check a formula. So you'll notice that each of these, the criteria is still locking to this one, so that's correct. But unfortunately the formula is not working because of course these continue to move across when they shouldn't. So we'll have to lock those as well. But first I just wanted to show you the other way of, instead of actually typing a $, if you just press F4, sorry, my function key needs to be on my keyboard. You'll notice that when I press that, hopefully you can see it in the formula range, it's basically filtering between each of the different options. So right now, neither of them are locked. Now both of them are locked. So column and row. Now the row is locked because the $'s before the number. And now only the column is locked because only the $' is before the E. So that's probably the quickest way to do this going forward, rather than having to type it. So we're going to leave that one as locked. Okay, so the next thing is, do we want to lock the range, which is this blue one over here? So we do. We want to lock this in place. So the questions you need to ask as we go is, do we want to lock the column? So the column is the letter C. And the answer is yes, because we don't want it to continue moving across, do we? Because this is the area we're going to look for, right? There's no services in any of these other columns. It's only in this one, so we need this column. So you see the $' before the C is now locked in there, don't we? So the second question we need to ask is, do we need to lock the row? So that would matter if we were pulling this if we were pulling this formula down, then yes, we would need to lock the row, because see what happens? It's now moved down one. Whereas if we had locked both of them, let me just lock that. So if we had locked both of them, let's see what happens. I drag it down now. See, this one is still locked in place. It hasn't moved down. And if we move it across, it's still in place despite us moving the formula across. So that's perfect. That's what we want. Again, the locking the row is optional because you're not dragging it down, but there's no harm in locking both, right? So you might as well do both in case something else changes later on in your spreadsheet, and maybe you'd end up pulling it down later on. So, there's no harm, but you might as well lock both in this case. So the final one that we need to just double check is this sum range. So we've locked the range, we've locked the criteria. What about the sum range? Well, I mean, technically, because we're not pulling the formula down at any point, we don't need to lock anything, right? Because we want this to continue to move across. Boing, boing, boing. You could argue that maybe we should lock the rows, and what that's going to do is it's going to lock the 4 and the 12. So it's going to make sure that if we do drag it down, it's not going to pull down this way. So what we could do is, technically, this is probably what I'd do. I would go F4 twice. That puts the lock sign before the 4 and the 12, but the E is free to move. The column is free to move. Let's press enter and see what happens when we drag this across. Perfect. So now the formula is working. You can see that's locked, and this is moving freely across and it's pulling the data. So now we can change this to window, and theoretically the answer should just tie into whatever's here, which it does, 129, 30, 41, 43, 60, 32. Yep, so that's working perfectly. Anyway, so that is, that's basically how absolute and relative formulas work. Yeah, I think that's all that I need to cover on this one. Hopefully you found that useful, and we will end the video there. Thanks for watching.